I do want to talk a little bit about reframing today for my little section. So, reframing is important. It's just slightly shifting our perspective. We're talking about innovation, and I think innovation is absolutely important. But more important than innovation, I think, is learning how to be innovative. Innovations can just be best practices, and we can come up with best practices and apply them in different contexts, and it may or may not work. But learning how to be innovative, learning how to adjust and come up with things that are best contextualized and suited for our context is absolutely important for our staff, whether they're CSM, TLs, AD, all the way to the top. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And to do so, I'm going to share a little illustration from a book called Creative Confidence by Tom and David Kelly. So Doug Dietz was a 24-year veteran of GE, and he specialized in the creation of MRI machines. In fact, a number of his machines qualified for the International Design Excellence Award, the Oscars of design. So one day in this story, he goes to an installation at a pediatric hospital of one of his machines. And he goes there to make sure that everything is set up properly, but also to potentially receive some compliments about his beautifully designed machine. As he goes there, he encounters and experiences something that changes his life. He sees a small child being led into the MRI with his or her dad. And he overhears the dad tell her, "We've talked about this. You can be brave." And all the while, this poor child is crying. The technician sees this and immediately gets on the phone and calls the anesthesiologist. It turns out that 80% of pediatric patients need sedatives when going through an MRI. Rather than this elegant, state-of-the-art piece of technology, this child saw his machine as something that was big, cold, and scary. For Doug Dietz, pride was replaced by shame because he was letting down the very patients he was trying to help. Thus began a time of introspection as well as fact-finding. He began a process of listening and learning. He talked to child specialists. He observed young kids at a daycare and interviewed teachers. He reached out to anybody and everyone who could help him. And the end product is this: not new technology, rather the same technology, but rather a whole new perspective, a complete reframing. This new MRI experience was called the Adventure Series. This whole MRI experience was transformed rather than a big scary medical procedure, but into a kid's adventure story. Not only were there decals and decor to make the whole kind of experience kid-friendly, the technicians were also given a script to follow that led their young patients through this adventure. Sedation greatly decreased, and patient satisfaction increased to 90%. And the best affirmation is another trip to a hospital where he went and he saw a little girl telling her mom after an MRI session, "Mom, can we come back tomorrow?" That simple question made all his effort worthwhile. The story of Doug Dietz illustrates a significant shift in the world of design. Things are going from a problem-based to a human-centered approach to design. And that shift, I think, is actually very, very important for us to understand, even when it comes to ministry as well. What does it mean to reframe our view of things? What does it mean to reframe how we approach things? Instead of looking at the problem, how do we do online ministry? How do we come up with a hybrid model of ministry? How can we listen to people? And I would go a step further and say, how can we listen to the Holy Spirit and see what He's doing in our midst? Now, this shift, I think, is best illustrated by a theoretical framework called design thinking. So this model that you see here is from, again, the Stanford Design School. Stanford Design School has this model where it just takes you through some very simple steps, but one, again, that kind of encapsulates this shift from problem-based to human-centered. So in design thinking, the first and arguably most important step, and the one that I want to focus on today, is empathy. How do we listen to people? How do we put ourselves in the shoe of a child, in Doug Dietz's case, as we think about designing products or ministries for people? So empathy, listening. The second step is defining. This is often called the sense-making stage. For Doug Dietz, it's what seems to be the problem here? Why are our people, our children, being sedated? Why are they not enjoying their experience? And so instead of looking at it just from a technical perspective, he has to step back and listen, and also try to make sense of what are kids feeling and how can we best meet their needs. So sense making and reframing, this is an important part in this defining stage. Ideation, that one's pretty clear. We start designing and creating things. The key in ideation, at least in the design thinking process, is as we listen, as we try to make sense of what's going on, ideation really is about kind of suspending judgment and just coming up with many ideas versus the one right, correct idea. And then it quickly moves into prototyping. All right, so what's the problem here for a pediatric patient? Is it the problem with the technology? And if not, what is it? Well, they seem scared. That's part of the sense making. Oh, we come up with a bunch of ideas, ways to kind of make the experience more fun. Maybe stickers or coloring the room differently. That might be one idea that's generated. And so it moves into the next stage of prototyping. Let's come up with a plan so we can test this out. I love the stage of prototyping because in this stage of prototyping, you're not building to last, you're building to test. And so in Doug Dietz's case, well, maybe kids just don't like the silver or metallic or the stale nature of the room. Maybe decals and colors and those types of things will make the MRI experience better. So that would be a prototype. And the next stage is testing. So we test this out. Let's see how this works. And then there's this arrow, which is the iteration. So once all this is done, let's listen. Let's hear. What do the patients have to say? Well, it's better than before, but we're still not really honing in on the real issue here. So the storytelling, collecting data, whether things go well, and especially when things go bad. And then we go back to listening again. All right, that seemed to be a step in the right direction. Kids seem to like the stickers, but that's only a good first impression. Maybe there's something more. And so that's one way that design thinking works. From moving away from a problem, let's design a great MRI machine, to really a human-centered. What is a child experiencing during an MRI? The reason why I love design thinking is it starts with something that all of us, especially in ministry, understand and know. The importance of listening, to incline our ear to what God is doing and what's happening in people's lives. These are pastoral muscles that all our staff have. And so I love this approach because it helps reframe our approach to ministry, and particularly as we think about becoming innovative ministers of the gospel, right? So how do we do this? So I want to give you one example of one way that this happened in my life ever since coming on staff. What you see on the screen is a little blog write-up that I did about coordinating our recent Pacific Region staff conference back at the end of April, early May. Just some context. I came back on staff after almost 20 years away in January, right after National Staff Conference. And as you know, in March, COVID hit. We had this staff conference lined up. A whole region was coming to Lake Tahoe 4 days, and we had to migrate now onto Zoom. And so yours truly got tasked with helping coordinate that. So the first thing I did, and again, being a big fan of design thinking, was listening. So had some time set aside at our RLT meeting to listen to our ADs, to hear what they were thinking. And I suspected that no one was looking forward to this conference, that it was going to be bad. And so in many ways, I just leaned into that. All right, so the question I asked as part of this listening empathy time was, what would make this conference bad? And sure enough, got a lot of feedback. And as I began to kind of sift through what people were saying, 3 things emerged of what would make this conference bad. The first was talking heads. Nobody wanted to hear talking heads. Number 2, somewhat surprisingly, people said, we don't want any more strategy and we don't want any more initiatives. As great as those were, our staff were just not in a place to be able to hear any new things. And thirdly was, we don't want a Saturday meeting. So the way that this online conference was lining up was it was going to be Thursday, Friday, Saturday. And so you can take a look at this blog. I'll have a link somewhere for you to take a look at. You have to excuse the title, Not Sucking. I need to change that title. But at the heart of it, it's a little bit like the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. It became a very powerful filter for me, very similar to that question I asked at the RLT, what would make this conference bad? And so anything that made this conference bad, we try to get rid of it. And again, served as a huge and powerful filter, and one that very much guided our conference into one that ultimately became really enjoyable and life-giving. So again, I'm sorry that I couldn't be there live to answer some questions, but feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to connect and talk more about this. So thank you again so much for this opportunity.